The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the small town courthouse. Maya Johnson stepped inside the old building with a calmness that seemed to stand in contrast to the chaos around her. She was dressed in simple clothes, a black blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, as if she were blending into the background of the world that often overlooked her. She had grown used to this quiet anonymity, despite what people didn't know about her, despite her Grammy Award-winning music career and the millions of fans who had once adored her. She was now a woman trying to find peace in the quiet of everyday life. She was here today, not as a celebrity, but as a woman facing a minor charge of disturbing the peace at a local charity event, an event where she had been asked to perform months ago. As Maya walked to the front of the courtroom, she could feel the eyes of the people in the room sweep over her, but none seemed to linger, none seemed to recognize her. They saw only a woman with no notable appearance, no claim to fame, just another person being caught up in the machinery of the legal system. She was used to it at this point, and though a small part of her wanted to scream out who she was and let the room know that they had no idea who they were dealing with, she held it in. She wasn't here to make a scene. Judge William Stevens sat at the front of the courtroom, his stern gaze sweeping across the room with practiced authority. He was an older man in his mid-60s, known for his no-nonsense approach to the law. His reputation was built on a history of strict rulings and unwavering beliefs in following the letter of the law. His courtroom was an extension of his personality, efficient, orderly, and without room for exception. His reputation was untarnished, and he saw this case as just another simple matter of a public disturbance. He had no reason to believe that Maya Johnson was anyone but another woman who had crossed the line at a charity event. When Maya's case was called, Judge Stevens barely looked up from his papers, his voice firm. As he asked her to stand, Maya stood tall, but silent. She knew what was coming. She had made a mistake, and now she would pay for it. She had apologized for her behavior at the event, even though it was blown out of proportion. But now it was time for the consequences. She wasn't here to argue her innocence. She wasn't interested in dragging things out. She had been in the spotlight before and knew the consequences of every action and every word. She simply wanted to move on with her life without making a spectacle of it. Judge Stevens looked down at the papers in front of him, his eyes scanning the details before him before looking up at her. With a stern expression, he spoke clearly and decisively, telling her that he was imposing a fine on her for the disturbance with no need for further discussion. His voice didn't waver, not even when he added that he believed the fine would serve as a deterrent for her and others who might think they could simply disregard public order. Maya nodded silently and accepted the ruling. The courtroom was quiet as she turned and walked out without another word. No one in the room knew what they had just witnessed. They saw only a woman who was paying for a mistake. But Maya knew this was not just any fine. It was a reminder of how quickly she had been judged and dismissed by the very system that should have taken the time to see who she truly was. As Maya left the courtroom, she couldn't help but feel a familiar weight settle over her shoulders. The fine wasn't the issue. It was the fact that the judge had decided her fate without a second thought, without taking a moment to understand who she was or what she had experienced. The moment she had stepped into that room, she had been reduced to nothing more than a name on a docket, a faceless person in a sea of cases, and just like that, her story had been written for her. It wasn't new to her, but it always stung. She walked out into the bright sunlight of the small town square. The world around her seemed unchanged, everyone moving with the same rhythms that existed before she had entered the courthouse. She could see people going about their business, chatting with each other, walking their dogs, or grabbing coffee at the nearby cafe. But no one paid her any special attention. No one recognized the woman who had once graced stages around the world singing songs that had touched millions of people. No one recognized the Grammy-winning artist. Maya Johnson was a name that could command a room in most cities, but here she was just another woman walking down the street unnoticed. Her life had been like this for the past few years. After stepping away from the music industry, she had released her last album several years ago, quietly retiring from the public eye. She had needed a break from the constant spotlight, from the pressure of always being on. She had longed for peace and for the chance to reconnect with the woman she had once been before the fame, before the whirlwind of red carpets and interviews and sold-out shows. She had wanted simplicity, and so she found herself in this quiet town in a modest house on the outskirts, living a life far from the one she had once known. But even in her solitude, she couldn't escape the reality of her past. The whispers of her name followed her wherever she went. Even here in this small town, she had run into people who had once been fans or who had recognized her on the rare occasions she ventured out, people who had asked for an autograph or wanted to take a picture, people who had seemed surprised to see her walking among them, as if celebrities didn't deserve the same small-town peace everyone else sought out. Today had been a reminder of all of that, all of those conflicting feelings that had come with her fame and her desire to escape it. But it wasn't just about the spotlight, it was about the judgment, the assumption that people could understand her life simply by looking at her, by placing her in a box labeled singer or celebrity, instead of seeing her for the person she was beneath that label. As Maya sat in her car and prepared to drive home, she took a deep breath. Her thoughts were interrupted by her phone buzzing on the passenger seat. She glanced at the screen and saw an alert for a local news story. The headline caught her eye. Local woman fined by judge. Turns out to be Grammy winner. Maya couldn't help but smile. Really, she wasn't surprised, but she also knew that this would only fuel the media frenzy that had already begun. The phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her publicist asking if she would like to comment on the story. Maya sighed and put the phone down on the seat beside her. She had always avoided the limelight when it came to her personal life, but this was different. This wasn't about her music or her career. It was about how people saw her. It was about how people would continue to make judgments about her based on who they thought she was, not who she actually was. And once again, she was thrust into the narrative of someone else's making. As she drove through the town, the wind in her hair, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this incident would become something bigger, something that would force her to face the world she had so carefully left behind. The news story about Maya's fine quickly spread beyond the small town's local channels. As soon as the headline hit social media, the story gained traction at an alarming speed. News outlets picked it up and began to delve into her background. It didn't take long before reporters and fans alike started to connect the dots between the woman who had been fined for a minor disturbance and the Grammy-winning artist who had once dominated the music charts. Maya's name was suddenly everywhere. At first, the attention was a curiosity. People were intrigued by the contrast between the woman in the courtroom and the woman who had once graced stages in front of thousands. The idea of a famous celebrity being fined for something so trivial struck a chord with many people. People began to share her music again, rediscovering her songs that had long since faded from the public eye. There were articles written about how she had once been at the forefront of her genre, how she had worked with some of the most iconic artists of her time. It wasn't long before the deeper investigation began. Reporters dug into her past, scoring old interviews and performances, trying to find more about the woman who had been publicly fined. Their excitement grew as they unearthed old footage of her at award shows, graciously accepting her Grammy Award and delivering speeches about love and perseverance. Her music videos were rediscovered and played on repeat as people listened to the lyrics of songs that had once been on the top of the charts. Now they had a new meaning for her fans. The woman who had once lived under a bright spotlight was now a woman paying a fine in a quiet courthouse. Soon enough, the media frenzy reached its peak. Every major news outlet had a piece on Maya Johnson. The focus shifted from the fine itself to the deeper questions about who she really was and why she had seemingly disappeared from the public eye. The speculation began with the usual assumptions about celebrities who left the spotlight. People wondered if she was burned out from fame or had gone into hiding to escape some personal drama. The truth, however, was far simpler and far more complicated than the media cared to explore. As Maya sat in her quiet home listening to the flood of notifications on her phone, she felt the weight of it all. The attention was overwhelming. But it wasn't the kind of attention she had wanted. Her life had been defined by public scrutiny for so long, and now it seemed as if it had come full circle, not because of her work, but because of a trivial moment in a courtroom, a moment that had nothing to do with her music or her impact on the world. It was just an unfortunate case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but now it had become a headline that was impossible to escape. She turned off her phone for a few hours, hoping for a break from the constant barrage of calls and messages. The silence was a welcome relief, but she knew it wouldn't last. People were talking about her, Even if she wasn't speaking out about it, the story was bigger than she ever imagined. It wasn't just about her fine, it was about perceptions and assumptions about who she was based on how she looked and what people knew about her past. A few days later, Maya was sitting in her living room when a message popped up from her old publicist asking if she had considered making a statement about the incident. Maya shook her head. She had no interest in engaging with the media. She had spent years building a life away from the spotlight. She had stepped back for a reason, and she wasn't about to let this moment redefine her. She wasn't a headline to be dissected and analyzed. She was a person with a past and a future that belonged to her alone. But even as she thought this, a part of her wondered if maybe the world was finally ready to understand her in a way it never had before. The media frenzy surrounding Maya only intensified with each passing day. News stations, social media influencers, and gossip websites all picked up on the story, but they couldn't seem to agree on what to make of it. Some outlets praised her for maintaining her privacy and remaining grounded despite her fame, while others criticized her for not speaking out and correcting the misunderstanding. There were even calls from fans for her to return to the music industry, claiming that her return would be the perfect way to reclaim her narrative and silence the critics. It didn't take long for Maya to realize that the focus on her was no longer about the vine itself. It had become a symbol of something bigger, a discussion about the way society viewed Black women, especially those who had once been in the public eye. The media's fascination with her identity wasn't just about her past music career, but about how they had reduced her to a headline and a story, ignoring the complexity of her experiences. Then, on a quiet morning, as Maya was sipping coffee and scrolling through the news, a breaking report caught her eye. Local woman fined by judge turns out to be Grammy winner. Judge unaware of her identity. The headline made her pause. The judge, Judge Stevens, was now being questioned in the media for not recognizing her during a court hearing. How could he have failed to identify someone of her stature? The story was now about his failure to do his due diligence, to recognize the influence of someone sitting in front of him. Maya felt a strange mix of emotions. She wasn't angry, but there was an undeniable sense of discomfort. It wasn't that she cared about the judge recognizing her. It was the realization that the world was so quick to judge her based on her appearance, and that even those in positions of authority weren't immune to that bias. She had been judged the moment she stepped into that courtroom, and now the conversation had shifted to his failure to do the same. It was as if no one could see her as a whole person, just a part of a story they had already written. The news cycle continued, but it wasn't just journalists who were talking about her. Friends, acquaintances, and even former colleagues began to reach out, expressing surprise and concern. Maya's phone buzzed constantly, and though she appreciated the support, it was exhausting. She was already tired of being at the center of a spectacle she hadn't asked for. Yet there was one message that caught her attention. It was from her old publicist, asking if she had considered a statement or an interview to clear the air. Maya had been avoiding any public response, but the message lingered in her mind. That afternoon, as she sat in her living room, her mind wandered to the moments when she had left the spotlight. She had been ready for peace, for a life where she could simply exist without constantly being under a microscope. But here she was again, dragged back into the public eye, forced to confront the complexities of her identity. In some ways, Maya was grateful that the conversation had shifted from her fine to a more serious discussion about assumptions, race, and privilege. Yet there was a part of her that wanted to escape it all once more. She wasn't sure what the right move was. Was it time to confront the issue head-on, to speak out and make people see the real Maya, the one they had misunderstood for so long? Or was it better to retreat again, to continue living quietly and allow the storm to pass as it always did? As she stared out the window, the thought of what might come next weighed heavily on her. She wasn't the same woman she had been before her fame, but was the world ready to see that? Would they ever truly understand her journey? As the media circus around Maya intensified, Judge Stevens found himself in a whirlwind of his own making. He had never expected his ruling on a simple case of public disturbance to become such a public spectacle. News outlets had turned their focus on him, questioning how he had failed to recognize the Grammy-winning artist sitting before him. Critics, both in the media and in the public, accused him of being out of touch, not doing his due diligence, and relying too heavily on assumptions about people based on how they looked or presented themselves. Judge Stevens, who had always prided himself on his experience and fairness, felt the sting of this scrutiny. He had been a judge for over 3 decades, and in all that time, he had never faced such public backlash. The more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became. He had ruled quickly, without truly considering the person in front of him. His decision had been based on a simple set of facts: Maya's presence at a charity event, the disturbance, and the fine. He had not looked beyond those facts. He hadn't bothered to understand who she was, to even ask why she might have been involved in the incident. And now, it seemed as if the entire world was questioning his judgment. The guilt gnawed at him. He couldn't help but wonder if he had missed something important, something beyond the surface. In his decades of experience, he had learned to trust his instincts, but now he realized how often those instincts have been shaped by unconscious biases. He had assumed that Maya, because she didn't fit the profile of a typical important person in his courtroom, didn't deserve the same level of attention. She had seemed like just another ordinary person, someone who wasn't likely to shake the status quo. But now, seeing the response from the public, it dawned on him that he had been wrong. In private moments, Judge Stevens replayed the case over and over in his mind. He thought about the look in Maya's eyes when he had imposed the fine, how she had accepted his judgment without protest. Had she known, even then, that he had failed to see her for who she really was? That small, quiet woman, sitting in front of him, was not just someone who had been fined for a minor disruption at an event. She was a woman with a history, with a legacy, and with a story that deserved to be heard. He began to question the ways he had approached his role as a judge. He had always prided himself on being impartial, but in this case, he hadn't been. He had made an assumption based on surface-level information. He hadn't taken the time to understand Maya, to learn about the woman beyond the charge she was facing. And now, the world was watching him. His error had become a symbol of a much larger issue: the biases that existed in the system, in the way people of color, especially black women, were treated. Stevens knew he had to do something. He couldn't let this go unanswered, not just for Maya's sake, but for his own. He had to make amends, even if it meant confronting his own shortcomings. But how? How could he possibly fix a mistake so public, so ingrained in his own sense of fairness? The answer, he decided, was simple. He needed to meet Maya. He needed to apologize to her directly, face to face. This wasn't just about correcting his mistake in a legal sense. It was about acknowledging his own flaws and recognizing the humanity of the person he had judged. He knew that doing this would be difficult. His pride, his reputation, his career, all of it was at risk. But he couldn't allow himself to hide from his mistake. He had to make it right, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, he reached for his phone, determined to find a way to reach Maya. He hoped she would understand, but even if she didn't, he knew he had to try. Maya was sitting on her porch one afternoon when she received an unexpected call. It was from the courthouse. She answered hesitantly, not sure what to expect. The voice on the other end was familiar. It was the clerk from the courthouse, and there was an unusual note in their voice. "Ms. Johnson, Judge Stevens would like to meet with you. He's asked if you would be willing to have a conversation about the case." Maya was taken aback. The last thing she expected was a direct request from the judge, the man who had fined her just weeks ago. She sat up straighter, her mind racing. Why now? Why reach out after all the media attention? What could he possibly want? "I'm listening," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, but knowing that her curiosity was taking over. The clerk explained that the judge had been reflecting on his decision and how it had been portrayed in the media. He realized he had acted hastily, that he had failed to see her as more than just the case before him. The clerk then conveyed the judge's request for a private meeting, one where he could apologize and perhaps make amends for his mistake. Maya felt a mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to dismiss the idea entirely. After all, she didn't owe anyone an explanation, especially not someone who had reduced her to a mere file number in their system. But another part of her, the one that had always wanted to be seen for who she truly was, felt compelled to give him a chance to explain. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about the fine or the media circus. Maybe it was about something deeper. I'll meet with him, Maya said finally, surprising even herself. She wasn't sure what she hoped to accomplish, but she knew that turning down the offer wouldn't lead to any kind of closure. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. Maya drove to the courthouse, her mind filled with questions. She didn't know what to expect from Judge Stevens. Would he be sincere? Would he truly understand what had gone wrong, or was this just another attempt to save face? As she parked her car and walked into the courthouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would change everything. When she entered the judge's chambers, Judge Stevens was standing by his desk. His expression was more solemn than she had ever seen it, and he immediately rose when she walked in. There was no pretense, no formality, just a man who seemed genuinely remorseful. "Miss Johnson, thank you for agreeing to meet with me," he began, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I owe you an apology, and I hope that by sitting down with you today, I can offer some kind of explanation, though I know it doesn't change anything." Maya nodded, waiting for him to continue. She wasn't sure what kind of apology would suffice, but she was listening. He had already taken the first step by acknowledging his mistake, and that, at least, was a start. Judge Stevens went on to explain how he had been consumed by the media storm and the backlash he faced. He admitted that, in his haste to deal with the case quickly, he had failed to see beyond Maya's appearance and her presence in the courtroom. He had reduced her to just another case, unaware that the woman before him had a life far more complicated than he could have imagined. "I am deeply sorry for not recognizing you for who you are," he said, his voice quiet, "and for the way my actions have affected you. It was wrong. I should have seen you as more than just a name and a charge. I regret that." Maya listened, her emotions shifting as the words sank in. She had never expected an apology, and certainly not one so direct. But as Judge Stevens spoke, she realized something important. This wasn't just about the fine. This was about a man acknowledging that the systems he had worked in and had benefited from were flawed. It was about him seeing her as a person and not a symbol. For the first time in a long while, Maya felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. The world hadn't always been kind to her, but this moment felt different. It was a step, a small one, but one toward breaking down the assumptions and biases that had defined so much of her life. "I appreciate your apology, Judge Stevens," Maya said quietly, her voice steady. "But more than that, I hope this moment makes us both think about the way we see others, not just the people we know, but everyone who crosses our path." Judge Stevens nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. He knew this conversation wasn't just a chance to make things right with her. It was a lesson for both of them. The meeting with Judge Stevens left Maya feeling a sense of unexpected relief. For the first time in weeks, the pressure of the media circus and the weight of public perception began to feel lighter. His apology was sincere, and although it couldn't undo the damage done, it had opened a door to understanding. An understanding that had been sorely lacking in their previous encounter. As she left the courthouse that day, Maya couldn't help but reflect on how rare it was for someone in a position of power to acknowledge their mistakes. So often, people were quick to defend their actions, to justify their decisions, but Judge Stevens had chosen the harder path. He had faced his own biases, his own assumptions, and had sought to correct them. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and for Maya, that was something she hadn't expected to find in such a public and uncomfortable situation. Word of the meeting quickly spread. News outlets picked up on the fact that the judge had met with Maya personally to apologize. Some applauded his decision to make amends, while others questioned whether his motives were purely to salvage his reputation. For Maya, it didn't matter what anyone else thought. She knew the truth of the encounter. It was about two people seeing each other for who they truly were, not as characters in a headline, but as human beings. In the following days, the media circus began to die down. The frenzy surrounding her fine and the judge's apology started to fade into the background as news stories and scandals took over. Maya, however, felt a shift within herself. The attention had been overwhelming, but it had also forced her to reckon with something she hadn't fully confronted: the way her identity had been shaped by others. As a black woman in the entertainment industry, Maya had always been defined by labels. She was a singer, a Grammy winner, a celebrity. But what did those labels really mean? Were they enough to define her? The time she had spent away from the public eye had been a choice, a decision to find peace and authenticity beyond the glitz and glamour. But now, as she reflected on the events of the past few weeks, she realized that she didn't need to hide from the world. She could continue to live authentically and still be seen for who she truly was, not just the public figure they remembered, but the woman she had become. Maya began to think about her music again, about the stories she had once shared through her songs. She had stepped away from the industry not because she had lost love for it, but because she had needed a break. The years spent away had given her the clarity to rediscover her own voice, without the noise, without the pressure of pleasing an audience. But now, with everything that had happened, Maya realized that perhaps the world wasn't entirely ready to let her go. It wasn't just about the media or the judge's apology. It was about the way people had connected with her through her music. They had found something in her words, in her melodies, that had touched them. The idea of returning to the music world seemed daunting at first, but now it felt like a possibility. Maybe it was time to return, but on her own terms. Maya had always been a fighter, even when the world seemed to see her as just another face in the crowd. She had fought for her place in the music industry, and now she was ready to fight for her voice again, not as a headline, but as herself. She didn't need anyone's approval, but she knew her story was worth telling. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to remind the world who Maya Johnson really was. As the days passed, she started making calls. The wheels of her next chapter were slowly beginning to turn, and though she didn't know where it would take her, she was ready to embrace whatever came next. She had learned to reclaim her narrative, not from the outside world, but from within herself. The stage had always been hers, but now it felt like she was finally ready to take it back, not as a figure defined by fame, but as a woman who had lived, loved, and learned from the journey. Weeks passed since Maya's meeting with Judge Stevens, and life began to feel less like a whirlwind and more like a quiet return to herself. The media had mostly moved on, and while there were still occasional stories that mentioned her name, they lacked the frenzy they once had. Maya had always known that the spotlight could be fleeting, but this experience had taught her something important, that she, herself, was not defined by the attention others gave her. Maya spent her time reflecting, writing music, and reconnecting with the parts of herself she had long since neglected. She found herself in the studio again, but this time there was no rush, no pressure to meet deadlines or expectations. She wrote from the heart, exploring new sounds and melodies, tapping into emotions she hadn't fully understood until now. The world of music had always been a place where she expressed herself, but now it was more than that. It was a way to reclaim control of her story. One evening, as she sat in her cozy living room, her phone rang. It was a familiar number, the music producer she had worked with years ago, before stepping away from the limelight. "Maya, it's been a while." His voice was warm, full of energy. "Listen, I've been hearing some of your new stuff. I'm telling you, this is gold. It's raw, it's real, and people need to hear it. What do you say? Ready to come back to the studio?" Maya smiled, feeling a surge of excitement she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, the idea of returning to the industry felt right, not as a person trying to reclaim her former glory, but as an artist ready to share a new chapter of her life with the world. "I think I'm ready," Maya said, her voice steady. "But this time, it's going to be on my terms." The producer agreed immediately, and within days, plans were set. Maya was heading back to the studio, but this time, there would be no pressure, no expectations from anyone but herself. It was her music, her voice, and the story she wanted to tell. As she worked on her new album, the songs began to take shape. Songs about resilience, self-discovery, and the power of owning one's own narrative. She wrote about the struggles she had faced, the times she had been misunderstood, and the strength it took to carve her own path. Each note she played, each lyric she penned, was a step closer to reclaiming her own power, not just as a Grammy-winning artist, but as a woman who had lived through it all. Months later, when the album was finished, Maya held the final product in her hands. feeling a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just the music that filled her with pride, it was the journey it had taken to get here. The lessons learned, the growth, and the realization that her worth was never tied to the headlines, the awards, or the public's perception of her. She was whole, just as she was, and the world would now hear the real Maya. When the album was released, it was met with critical acclaim. Fans old and new embraced the music, praising the depth and honesty in her songs. Maya felt at peace, knowing that she had shared her truth with the world, not the truth they expected, but the one she had lived. The judge's apology, the media circus, and the entire ordeal had taught Maya a powerful lesson: that reclaiming your story is not just about making noise, but about finding the courage to be yourself, no matter the consequences. She had emerged from the experience stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next. Maya had never been one to shy away from challenges, and now, as she stood on the stage once again, it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the knowledge that she had finally, fully embraced who she truly was. And that, she realized, was the greatest award of all.